Are you having a good time?
Yes, this is so much fun. Can we get dessert too?
It was a quiet evening when the protagonist stepped out of their car, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The street was softly lit by the warm glow of streetlights, and the gentle hum of traffic created a calm background. They adjusted their jacket, took a deep breath, and reminded themselves that blind dates were always a little unpredictable. Some were wonderful, some were awkward, and some could be a disaster. But tonight, they were determined to stay open to whatever would happen. The cafe was just a few steps away, a small cozy place with wooden tables and soft music playing in the background. As they pushed the door open, a little bell jingled, announcing their arrival. The protagonist scanned the room quickly, hoping to see a familiar face waiting. But the sight that greeted them was an empty table, perfectly set with 2 cups of coffee, a small vase with fresh flowers, and a faint scent of freshly baked pastries. A flutter of nervousness ran through them. They checked their phone for the 5th time. Seeing no new messages, their minds started spinning with possibilities. Maybe the other person had a last-minute emergency. Maybe they had forgotten. Or maybe this was some kind of mix-up. The more they waited, the more their imagination ran wild, each scenario more dramatic than the last. They tried to distract themselves by observing the cafe. It was a small but charming place, with soft amber lighting and walls lined with bookshelves filled with novels and travel guides. A few other patrons sat quietly, sipping their drinks or working on laptops. The calm atmosphere was comforting, but at the same time, it made the empty table even more noticeable. The protagonist's hands fidgeted with the menu. Although they weren't really looking at the items, they pretended to study the coffee options, hoping the act of doing something would ease their nerves. The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly, each one dragging slower than the last. They took small sips of water, trying to convince themselves that patience was key, but the unease kept growing. They thought about all the stories they had heard about blind dates. Some were awkward from the very start, with awkward silences and strange small talk. Others started awkwardly, but turned into something wonderful. They wondered if this night would be one of those stories, or just another tale of disappointment. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Each sound of the door opening made them glance up, heart skipping a beat. The protagonist tried to calm themselves by focusing on their breathing. Inhale slowly, exhale slowly, they told themselves. But every time they heard laughter from another table or saw someone being greeted warmly by a friend, a tiny pang of envy struck them. They longed for a similar warm greeting, a smile, a familiar face, even if it was a stranger for now. They noticed the small details around them, trying to distract their mind. The steam rising from a cup of coffee, the gentle hum of the music, the smell of pastries, even the way sunlight from the window reflected off the table. It was all beautiful, yet none of it compared to the feeling of someone finally walking in and sitting across from them. The empty chair across from the table felt like a silent question, waiting for an answer. Time seemed to stretch even longer, and the protagonist began to wonder if they were imagining the whole thing. Maybe the blind date wasn't happening. Maybe it had been canceled without notice. Their thoughts bounced back and forth between hope and doubt, each one stronger than the last. They fidgeted with their watch, tapping their fingers against the table, their mind racing with what-ifs. And just as the tension reached its peak, they heard soft footsteps at the entrance, a sound that made their heart leap. They turned quickly, eyes searching, hoping that this was the moment the awkward wait would end. Whoever was coming through the door would change the night completely. They didn't know yet that it wouldn't just be one person arriving, but 3 little girls with big smiles and tiny hands, ready to turn this awkward moment into something unforgettable. The protagonist couldn't have predicted what was about to happen, but in that quiet cafe, with a warm cup of coffee in hand and a heart full of nervous excitement, they waited, unsure whether to laugh, sigh, or simply hold their breath. The night had only just begun, and the empty table was about to be filled in the most unexpected way. The protagonist sat at the small cafe table, staring at the empty chair across from them. Every few seconds, they glanced toward the door, hoping to see someone walk in, but the cafe remained calm and quiet. The gentle hum of conversation from other tables felt distant, almost like it belonged to another world. Their heart beat a little faster with every sound of the door jingling, only to be disappointed each time when it wasn't the person they were waiting for. Time seemed to stretch and bend in the most unusual way. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last. Like the air itself was thick with anticipation, they looked around again, noticing details they hadn't paid attention to before: the warm glow of the lamps, the soft murmur of the barista's steaming milk, even the faint smell of cinnamon from the pastries. All of it was comforting, yet nothing could fill the growing sense of awkwardness in their chest. The protagonist tried to distract themselves by scrolling through their phone, checking messages that weren't there. Each glance only reminded them that they were alone, and every notification that didn't appear felt like another small disappointment. They leaned back in their chair, crossed their arms, and tried to breathe slowly, repeating in their mind that patience was important, that maybe life had a reason for making them wait, even if they couldn't see it yet. Their thoughts began to wander, imagining every possible scenario. Maybe their date had been caught in traffic, maybe there had been an emergency, or maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't show up at all. The more they imagined, the more their nerves grew, each thought tugging at a mix of hope and anxiety, like a tiny battle in their chest. To pass the time, they watched the other patrons. A group of friends laughed over shared stories at one table, while a young couple whispered softly to each other at another. Even a single person sipping tea and reading a book seemed to have something magical about them. The protagonist smiled faintly, imagining how their own story might unfold, though still unsure whether it would be awkward or wonderful. Every sound in the cafe suddenly felt louder, more significant: the clinking of cups, the shuffle of chairs, even the soft footsteps of someone walking by. Their imagination started to play tricks on them. Each noise made them turn, expecting to see the person they had been waiting for, only to realize again that the chair remained empty, and the small vase of flowers seemed to watch them silently. The protagonist tried to focus on small, mindful things, hoping to calm their racing mind. They traced the rim of their coffee cup, feeling its warmth. Noticing the steam curling up in soft spirals, they observed the intricate patterns in the wooden table, the texture of the chair they were sitting on. These tiny details grounded them, even if just a little, offering brief moments of peace amid the nervous tension. As minutes stretched on, they started to wonder if they were overthinking everything. Maybe the other person would arrive any moment. Maybe the awkwardness was just part of the fun. They imagined what the first words might be, how they would introduce themselves, whether there would be laughter or a long silence. The possibilities seemed endless, and each one carried a mixture of excitement and fear. And then, without warning, the quiet tension was broken by soft, little footsteps approaching, light and hurried, but not rushed. The protagonist's head snapped toward the entrance, eyes wide, heart pounding in anticipation. But it wasn't what they expected, not just a single person, but three little girls, bright-eyed and smiling, walked in together, holding hands and chattering softly. Their energy was so pure, so joyful. It immediately filled the empty space with life. The girls walked confidently toward the protagonist, stopping at the empty chair, and in unison, with tiny voices that were both sweet and bold, they said, "My dad is apologetic he's late." The words struck a chord of surprise and amusement, melting away the awkward tension that had been building for what felt like hours. Suddenly, the empty chair didn't feel lonely anymore. The air felt lighter, filled with the laughter and innocence of children, hinting that this blind date would be far from ordinary. The protagonist leaned back, a smile spreading across their face, realizing that sometimes the best moments happen when you least expect them. And in that quiet cafe, the waiting, the silence, and the nerves suddenly felt like a perfect prelude to something unforgettable. The cafe felt suddenly alive, as if the three little girls had brought the entire room into motion with their tiny footsteps and cheerful chatter. The protagonist blinked, barely able to process what was happening. Their nerves from the long wait melted into curiosity and surprise. Who were these little girls, and why were they talking to them? The girls were full of energy, bouncing slightly as they walked toward the table, their laughter soft but contagious. The protagonist watched as they stopped in front of the empty chair, and in perfect unison, they announced, "My dad is apologetic he's late." The words were simple, but the timing and innocence made them utterly unforgettable. The protagonist couldn't help but smile, a mix of relief and amusement washing over them. The girls didn't wait for a response, instead chatting among themselves as if the protagonist wasn't there. Their little hands gestured wildly while they talked, their voices overlapping in a playful rhythm. One of them pointed toward the entrance, pretending to explain why their dad was late. Another giggled and added her own version of the story. Each comment was filled with honesty, humor, and that unique charm only children could bring. The protagonist leaned forward slightly, intrigued, noticing the differences in their personalities already. One girl seemed confident and outgoing, taking charge of the conversation. Another appeared shy, glancing around but smiling whenever someone noticed her. The third girl was somewhere in between, curious and observant, chiming in at the perfect moments. It was as if these tiny humans had already taken control of the room, yet in the most innocent way imaginable. For a moment, the protagonist forgot about the awkwardness of the blind date. The empty chair that had caused so much anxiety no longer felt lonely. Instead, the space was now filled with life, laughter, and curiosity. The three little girls had a way of commanding attention without even trying, drawing not just the protagonist's eyes, but also smiles from nearby tables. Some patrons even glanced over, charmed by the scene unfolding before them. The protagonist tried to respond, offering a polite smile and a few kind words, but the girls were already moving on, telling stories about their father, about school, and about little adventures they had experienced that week. Each tale was filled with humor and mischief, but also hints of love and respect for the parent they were waiting for. It became clear that the father, whoever he was, must be someone who valued honesty and family, someone who had raised these girls with care, patience, and warmth. The cafe felt smaller now, not in a negative sense, but in a way that made everything feel more intimate. The music in the background seemed to soften. The clinking cups and low conversations faded into a gentle hum. The focus was now entirely on the little group, and the protagonist felt a sense of anticipation that was entirely different from before. This was no longer a blind date waiting to begin. This was a story in motion, unfolding in front of their eyes. The girls' laughter was interrupted by a sudden stop at the door. The protagonist's gaze followed the movement, and there he was, the father, slightly flustered, brushing imaginary dust off his jacket, and wearing a wide, apologetic smile. He paused for a moment, taking in the scene, the girls giggling around him, the table, the small vase of flowers, and then he looked at the protagonist with genuine warmth. His presence had a calm confidence, and yet, he seemed instantly aware of the effect the girls had created. He waved politely, giving a small bow of apology, saying, "I'm so sorry I'm late, girls." The girls responded with laughter and playful complaints, reminding him of the precious moments he had missed. The protagonist observed quietly, feeling a mixture of relief, amusement, and admiration. The awkward waiting, the nervous anticipation, it all led to this unforgettable entrance. This moment wasn't just about meeting someone new. It was about witnessing a family's connection and the unexpected joy that came from it. For the protagonist, the blind date had transformed completely. The empty chair was no longer intimidating. It had become a symbol of possibility, of warmth, and of stories yet to be told. The girls had broken the ice. The father had arrived. And what could have been just another ordinary evening was now something unique, something special, something worth remembering long after the cups of coffee were finished. And as the father and daughters settled at the table, the protagonist realized something profound. Sometimes, the most unforgettable moments happen when life surprises you the most. And that night, in that small cafe, a simple blind date had turned into the beginning of a story full of laughter, warmth, and unexpected charm. The three little girls sat down at the table, chattering excitedly as if they had known the protagonist forever. Their tiny chairs squeaked slightly under their weight, and the table seemed to come alive with their energy. The protagonist couldn't help but watch them in amazement, feeling a warm smile spreading across their face. They had never expected a blind date to start like this, and yet, it was already turning into something completely unforgettable. One of the girls leaned forward, her hands clasped together, and explained in a serious tone, "Our dad was helping someone at work, so he is late." The way she spoke was both sincere and charming, like she genuinely wanted the protagonist to understand the importance of patience. The second girl jumped in, waving her hands as she added, "He said he's really sorry, but he couldn't leave on time." Her honesty was refreshing, and her tone made it impossible not to smile. The third girl giggled, bouncing slightly in her seat, and whispered, "He told us to tell you he likes surprises." The protagonist laughed softly, feeling the tension from the long wait dissolve completely. They realized that the girls weren't just telling stories. They were giving life to the moment, turning what could have been an awkward beginning into something playful and endearing. Each explanation added a new layer of warmth and charm to the room, and the nervous energy that had filled the protagonist's chest slowly melted away, replaced by curiosity and delight. The girls continued to talk about their father, describing his little habits and funny quirks, how he always tried to make breakfast on Sundays, even if he burned the toast, how he loved telling silly jokes, even if no one laughed, how he sometimes danced around the living room in his socks just to make them giggle. Each story painted a picture of a kind, loving man who clearly adored his daughters. The protagonist could almost see him through their words, and it made the anticipation of meeting him even more exciting. Between giggles and whispered comments, the girls explained how they had been looking forward to this evening for days. They had told their father how important it was to arrive on time. And yet, life had other plans. The way they spoke about him was filled with admiration and affection, and it was impossible not to feel that same warmth as an outsider. The girls' energy and innocence had transformed the empty table into a scene of life, laughter, and connection. The protagonist tried to join the conversation, asking the girls gentle questions about their school, their favorite games, and what made their dad special. The girls responded with enthusiasm, occasionally teasing each other and making little jokes. Their laughter was bright, light, and contagious, echoing in the small cafe and drawing smiles from nearby tables. The protagonist realized that the presence of these little humans had completely shifted the atmosphere, from awkward anticipation to something lively, heartwarming, and full of character. It wasn't just the stories they told, it was the way they told them. The confidence, the honesty, and the playful mischief in their voices created a connection that felt instant and genuine. The protagonist could sense that this blind date was no longer about a first meeting between two adults. It was about witnessing the love, joy, and humor of a small family, and sharing in that magic. The girls had become guides, introducing the protagonist to the heart of the person they were about to meet. As the conversation continued, the protagonist glanced at the empty chair across from them, imagining who would fill it. Their imagination was now bright with anticipation rather than anxiety. They felt a sense of comfort, knowing that whoever arrived would be someone who had clearly nurtured love and happiness in these three little girls. The charm, honesty, and warmth of the moment had completely rewritten the story of the blind date. And just when the protagonist thought it couldn't get any better, the little girls giggled again, whispering excitedly to each other, as if sharing a secret. Their voices were full of mischief and delight, promising that the night ahead would be full of surprises, laughter, and unforgettable memories. The protagonist leaned back slightly, smiling, feeling a sense of anticipation and joy that was far beyond anything they had imagined when they first walked through the cafe door. The empty chair was no longer empty, not in spirit. The room seemed full, alive with charm, honesty, and a playful energy that only children could create. And as the girls continued to explain, the protagonist realized that this blind date had already turned into something extraordinary, something heartwarming, and something that would be remembered for a long time. Just as the girls finished their animated chatter, the door to the cafe opened again, and the sound of soft footsteps filled the room. The protagonist's eyes immediately turned toward the entrance, heart beating faster than before. Standing there was a man who seemed slightly out of breath, his jacket slightly rumpled, and a warm, apologetic smile on his face. He looked around the cafe as if searching for someone, and when his eyes landed on the table with the three little girls and the protagonist, his expression shifted instantly to relief and happiness. "Hello," he said softly, his voice calm, yet full of warmth. "I'm so sorry I'm late." The girls giggled and leaned forward, pointing at him and saying things like, "He was helping a friend, and he promised he'd be here." Their voices overlapped with excitement, but the father remained patient, kneeling slightly to adjust their chairs and making sure each one was comfortable. The protagonist watched quietly, struck by how naturally caring and attentive he was, even in the middle of a bustling cafe. As he finally settled into the chair across from the protagonist, he offered a small, genuine smile, and immediately, the nervous tension in the room seemed to ease. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen, like he genuinely wanted to know them and understand them. The protagonist noticed the subtle kindness in his eyes, the small gestures of patience as he listened to the girls, responding to each comment with humor or warmth, never rushing or interrupting. It was a first impression that spoke louder than words. This was a man who clearly valued family and connection. The girls continued their playful chatter, sharing little anecdotes about their father. How he sometimes tried to make pancakes but ended up with more flour on the floor than in the pan. How he always remembered little details about their day. How he sometimes danced around the living room just to make them laugh. Each story painted a picture of a loving, fun, and devoted parent, and the protagonist couldn't help but feel impressed. Their initial curiosity and nervousness slowly shifted into admiration and warmth, realizing that this blind date was about more than just two strangers meeting. It was about encountering a man who had clearly shaped love and happiness in the lives of his daughters. The father laughed softly at one of the girls' exaggerated stories, his laughter gentle and genuine, not loud, but the kind that makes everyone nearby feel included in the joy. He apologized again, not in a way that felt formal, but in a natural, honest tone, showing that he valued the other person's time. The protagonist was struck by how effortless his charm was, not flashy or forced, but rooted in kindness, patience, and authenticity, something that made the first impression unforgettable. He then turned his attention to the protagonist, offering a warm handshake and a friendly smile. "Thank you for waiting," he said. "It means a lot." The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that immediately put the protagonist at ease. The initial nervousness and awkwardness that had filled the cafe earlier vanished, replaced by a comforting sense of genuine connection. They realized that first impressions weren't about perfection or timing. They were about presence, attentiveness, and the ability to make others feel valued. The girls, sensing that the mood had shifted positively, snuggled closer to their father, occasionally whispering little comments or giggling at inside jokes. The father responded with patience, playfulness, and love, showing the protagonist that his warmth wasn't just for appearances. It was the way he lived. The protagonist couldn't help but notice how smoothly he balanced humor, care, and attentiveness, both toward his daughters and the new person sitting across from him. As they began to talk more naturally, the father shared little glimpses of his life, stories filled with humor, honesty, and humility. The protagonist laughed at his lighthearted jokes and felt touched by his sincerity when he spoke about family. His presence created a sense of ease and comfort that the protagonist hadn't expected. It was remarkable how quickly the atmosphere had shifted from awkward waiting to engaging conversation, full of laughter, warmth, and mutual curiosity. By the time the first cups of coffee were placed on the table, the protagonist felt that this blind date was already unlike anything they had imagined. The empty chair that had caused so much anxiety now felt like the center of a story filled with charm, heart, and life. The father's first impression was complete, not just polite or friendly, but unforgettable, a combination of warmth, patience, humor, and genuine care that set the stage for what was quickly becoming a magical evening. The protagonist leaned back, smiling, feeling gratitude for the unexpected journey that had begun, the awkwardness of waiting, the nervous anticipation. It had all led to this moment. The man across from them was more than just a date. He was a reflection of love, patience, and the joy of family. And as the girls continued to giggle and chatter, the protagonist realized that this blind date was already a story worth remembering, one that would stay in their heart long after the cafe lights dimmed. The father settled into his seat, and the girls immediately resumed their lively chatter, occasionally glancing up at the protagonist with wide eyes and expectant smiles. It was clear that they wanted the new guest to feel included, and the protagonist felt a sudden warmth at the thoughtfulness of their tiny gestures. The air at the table was no longer tense or awkward. It was filled with laughter, curiosity, and a sense of shared excitement. As the father began telling little stories about their daily life, the protagonist listened intently, drawn into the world these three little girls had built. He spoke about mundane things, grocery trips, homework, and weekend routines, but each story was sprinkled with humor and love. Every sentence revealed his character, patience, and the playful way he interacted with his daughters. The girls would jump in with corrections or exaggerations, giggling uncontrollably when their father pretended to be embarrassed by a silly mistake. The protagonist found themselves laughing more freely than they had in weeks. The initial nervousness and self-consciousness had completely faded, replaced by genuine enjoyment. It wasn't just about the date anymore. It was about witnessing an authentic family dynamic. The way the father and daughters communicated, joked, and teased one another was effortless, yet it held depth and affection that the protagonist could feel in the room. Occasionally, one of the girls would lean over, whispering something mischievous to the protagonist, their small hands brushing briefly against theirs. These tiny moments of connection created a bond almost instantly. The protagonist began to see the father not only as a charming man, but as someone who had shaped three incredible little personalities through love, patience, and attention. Every glance and gentle touch between them was a lesson in kindness and human connection. The conversation soon turned to shared hobbies and interests, and the father asked the protagonist about their favorite books, movies, and childhood memories. The girls chimed in with their opinions, sometimes silly, sometimes insightful, and often completely unexpected. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and it sparked stories and laughter that bounced back and forth across the table. It felt less like a formal blind date, and more like an impromptu gathering of friends who were discovering one another's worlds. At one point, the father made a playful remark about how his daughters always seemed to outwit him in games or conversation, and the girls immediately protested, giggling and defending themselves. The protagonist joined in, teasing gently, and soon they were all laughing together. The cafe, which had seemed quiet and still only moments before, now buzzed with energy and joy, drawing glances from nearby tables. Some patrons smiled knowingly, sensing the magic of a connection forming in front of them. What struck the protagonist most was the ease with which the father balanced humor and attentiveness. The girls' voices never felt dismissed, their stories never interrupted. Yet there was a warmth and presence in his gaze that made the protagonist feel included as well. It was as if he had an invisible rhythm that allowed everyone to feel heard, valued, and appreciated. The experience was both comforting and enlightening, showing how genuine connection could be created naturally, without forced effort or pretension. The protagonist noticed small gestures that spoke volumes. How the father refilled a girl's drink without being asked, how he encouraged a shy comment with a smile, how he laughed at the smallest jokes with genuine amusement. These subtle actions revealed a man who was not only charming, but deeply kind-hearted and thoughtful. The girl's energy acted as a bridge, connecting the protagonist to a side of him that felt authentic, warm, and completely engaging. By the time dessert arrived, a small plate of pastries that the girls insisted they share, the protagonist felt completely at ease. The laughter, stories, and playful debates had created a bond that went beyond a typical first meeting. The empty chair at the beginning of the evening seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant presence of family, humor, and shared humanity. For the protagonist, this was more than a blind date. It was a glimpse into a world filled with joy, spontaneity, and love, the kind of world that could only be created by people who truly cared for one another. It was a lesson in connection, in patience, and in the beauty of simple, authentic moments. And as the conversation continued, full of laughter, teasing, and stories, the protagonist realized that this night would be remembered not just for who they were meeting, but for the warmth and charm that had entered their life unexpectedly. As the evening progressed, the protagonist found themselves reflecting quietly on everything that had happened so far. The initial nerves and awkwardness that had filled their chest when they first arrived at the cafe now seemed like a distant memory, replaced instead by a warm sense of understanding and connection that had quietly unfolded in the most unexpected way. Watching the father interact with his three little daughters, the protagonist realized that some of the most important lessons in life didn't come from books, advice, or careful planning. They came from observing simple moments of love, patience, and honesty. How he laughed at their jokes, how he encouraged them when they were shy, how he balanced humor with care. It was all teaching a subtle lesson about how to connect with others, about how to be present and sincere. The little girls had played a larger role than anyone could have anticipated. Their energy, honesty, and fearless innocence had transformed a potentially awkward evening into a heartwarming, memorable experience. The protagonist understood that life sometimes has its own timing, and trying to force things rarely works. Instead, it's the unexpected interruptions, the small surprises, and the little bursts of joy that often leave the deepest impressions. Through laughter and conversation, the protagonist also realized the value of patience, something they had been testing unknowingly throughout the night. Waiting alone for a date to arrive had felt unbearable at first, each passing minute stretching endlessly. Yet, that wait had prepared them for the extraordinary moment when the three little girls walked in, bright-eyed and unapologetically honest, changing the energy of the room completely. It was a reminder that patience often leads to rewards far beyond what we imagine. Another lesson became clear as the father shared stories about his daughters, about his life, and the small ways he nurtured love in their household. Life wasn't about perfection or always being on time. It was about showing up with sincerity, humor, and care. The protagonist saw that a person's true character is revealed not in grand gestures, but in everyday interactions, how they listen, how they respond, and how they make others feel valued. The protagonist also learned the power of human connection in its purest form. Connection didn't require fancy dates, extravagant plans, or scripted conversations. It required openness, authenticity, and a willingness to engage with whatever life puts in front of you. The little girls had created bridges of trust and warmth almost effortlessly, inviting the protagonist into their world with playful energy and honesty. And the father had mirrored that openness, showing kindness, humor, and genuine care, making the protagonist feel completely welcome and included. Amid the laughter, shared stories, and playful teasing, the protagonist realized that first impressions could be misleading. Often, anxiety and nerves cloud the way we perceive situations, but when given the chance to observe, to listen, and to be present, those initial fears dissolve, replaced by understanding and warmth. The night had turned what could have been an ordinary, awkward encounter into an extraordinary lesson in patience, empathy, and joy. The protagonist also reflected on how life's surprises often come in unexpected forms. A small interruption, three little girls bursting into a quiet cafe, laughter echoing in the air, had turned a nervous evening into a moment of magic. It was a lesson that the best experiences sometimes arrive unannounced, and the key was to embrace them fully, without hesitation. Without the girls' charm, honesty, and lively energy, the evening might have remained tense and forgettable, but with them, it became unforgettable, a story that would be remembered for years. Finally, the protagonist understood that the night was about more than just a blind date. It was about witnessing love, patience, and joy in action. It was about realizing that connection comes in many forms, through laughter, kindness, playfulness, and honesty, and that the most memorable moments often happen when we least expect them, when we allow ourselves to be present, open, and willing to embrace the beauty of life's little surprises. As the evening wound down, the protagonist felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the father and his daughters, but for the lessons they had unknowingly shared. It was a reminder that sometimes, the best teachers aren't in classrooms or books. They're in everyday people, small moments, and unexpected encounters. The protagonist knew that this night would stay with them, shaping how they approached life, patience, and connection, long after the cafe lights dimmed. By the time the evening was winding down, the cafe had transformed from a quiet, ordinary place into a lively scene filled with laughter, warmth, and unexpected charm. The protagonist sat back in their chair, watching the three little girls chatter happily with their father, their faces glowing with joy. It was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier, the table had been empty, the chair across from them silent, and their nerves stretched tight with anticipation. Now, the room felt full, not just with people or noise, but with connection, with genuine human moments that were small yet unforgettable. The girls had succeeded in turning what might have been an awkward blind date into something extraordinary. Their innocent energy and honesty had opened the door to laughter and shared stories, and their father's warmth, patience, and charm had filled it completely. The protagonist realized how much the night had shifted their own perspective. From the very first nervous minutes of waiting, they had grown to understand something profound about life, about patience, and about connection. They had learned that sometimes the most memorable experiences happen when you least expect them, and often through the smallest gestures. The girl's simple statement, "My dad is apologetic, he's late," had been the key that unlocked an evening full of life and heart. The father, noticing the protagonist's quiet reflection, leaned slightly and smiled warmly. "I know this evening started a bit unexpectedly," he said, "but I'm glad you stayed." The girls were excited, and, well, I hope you enjoyed the stories. His eyes were calm, kind, and full of genuine sincerity, and the protagonist nodded, feeling a sense of connection that went far beyond first impressions. The awkwardness that had defined the start of the evening was now replaced by comfort, understanding, and even gratitude. As the girls finished their dessert, they insisted on helping clear the plates, playfully arguing over who would do what. Their laughter was infectious, and the protagonist found themselves laughing along, completely immersed in the small, ordinary moments that felt anything but ordinary. Each giggle, playful whisper, and little hand gesture had transformed the evening into something truly special. It was in these moments the protagonist realized that life's beauty often revealed itself. The father shared one final story about the girls, a small anecdote about how they had worked together to make a card for him just that morning. Each little action spoke volumes about the love and bond within the family, and the protagonist felt honored to witness it firsthand. It wasn't just a blind date anymore. It was a glimpse into a life full of warmth, playfulness, and connection, a life that had unexpectedly welcomed them in for a few precious hours. The protagonist felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the father and daughters but for the way the night had unfolded. Each moment had taught them something about patience, about the joy of surprises, about the power of authenticity, and about how love and laughter can transform even the simplest situations into something unforgettable. The lessons of the night would stay with them, shaping the way they looked at connections, surprises, and even ordinary life. As the family finally prepared to leave, the girls waved enthusiastically, hugging their father and then extending shy but warm hugs toward the protagonist. "Bye," they called out in chorus, their voices full of cheer and mischief. The protagonist waved back, feeling lighter, happier, and more connected than they had in a long time. It was the perfect ending to a night that had started with anxiety and uncertainty, and yet had become a story of laughter, love, and unexpected joy. Walking out of the cafe afterward, the protagonist reflected on the night, smiling to themselves. The empty chair that had once seemed so intimidating had been filled, not just with a person, but with stories, energy, warmth, and a sense of human connection that would linger long after the lights dimmed. They understood now that life's most memorable moments often come when we least expect them, when we allow ourselves to be present, and when we embrace the joy of small surprises. The night had begun as a simple blind date, and it ended as an unforgettable memory, a story of connection, laughter, and heartwarming humanity, one that would stay in the protagonist's mind and heart forever, and perhaps even shape the way they approached life, relationships, and the beauty of unexpected moments in the days to come. And as the cool night air greeted them outside, they couldn't help but smile, knowing that sometimes the best stories in life are the ones we never see coming.